Hi, I'm Ray from Phone Arena, and this is our video comparison between the Google Nexus 5 and the Apple iPhone 5s. Google's Nexus phones have had a relatively light impact thus far, but things are getting more serious with each new Nexus device that Google pushes out on the market. Last year's Nexus 4, in particular, caused quite a bit of buzz, mostly for its astonishing price. With this year's Nexus 5 though, Google is pushing things even further. The amazing starting price of $349 has been kept unchanged, but the hardware you're getting in exchange is absolutely top-notch. However, a great smartphone experience isn't exclusively defined by under-the-hood goodness and a cheap price tag. The Nexus 5 is a very well-rounded, feature-packed product, but it definitely lacks a rather important quality, and that is exquisiteness. Having said that, the iPhone 5s is probably the biggest antipode to the Nexus 5. It's expensive, it ignores some of the features a true geek would demand, and it puts more emphasis on external design than the whole Nexus line combined, with the exception of the Nexus 1. So let's take a look at how two of the finest smartphones money can buy right now stack up against each other. Stunning appearance has always been one of Apple's hallmark features when it comes to its products, and this observation is fully valid with the iPhone 5s. Apple's finest is a piece of great computing power tucked inside an astonishing glass and metal body. It's an iconic design and one that can be easily recognized from miles away. It's thin, light, and good-looking. On the other hand, Google has gone for a decidedly humble design with its Nexus 5. The handset is built from plastic with a soft touch finish on the back panel. It's okay if you like this type of material, but we would have liked it much more if there was some effort going into the appearance of the handset. Instead, it's looking rather ordinary, especially the all-black version, which is as generic as it gets. We do appreciate the fact that it's also quite thin and light for its size though. In terms of comfort, it's evident that LG has tried to shrink those bezels down as much as possible, so that the Nexus 5 can have a decent footprint despite its massive 5-inch display. They have definitely done a great job, but in the end, the Nexus 5 is still a rather big phone. In contrast, the iPhone 5s is naturally much smaller and easier to handle. It's not as cool when it comes to multimedia consumption due to its smaller display, but general usage of the smartphone does benefit vastly from the smaller form factor. We wouldn't expect a low-quality build from a Google-influenced phone, and the Nexus 5 doesn't disappoint. Even though it isn't anything to write home about aesthetically, it's still well made with a sturdy-feeling body and good physical keys. It cannot measure up to the excellence presented by the iPhone 5s in these areas, but it's a decent performer. The iPhone 5s features a fingerprint scanner built right into its clicky home button. The so-called Touch ID sensor allows you to unlock your passcode-secured phone with just a touch of the home button, as well as to easily authorize iTunes and App Store purchases, removing the need to enter a lengthy password every once in a while. It's a much appreciated feature and one that is unapologetically missing from the Google Nexus 5. The 5-inch screen of the Nexus 5 is among the better ones around. It not only sports an impressive diagonal, but is also relatively accurate as far as color representation goes. Similarly to the iPhone 5s's 4-inch display, it uses IPS LCD technology. The iPhone 5s has a resolution of 640 by 1136 pixels. On paper, these numbers don't appear to be particularly threatening for the Nexus 5's 1080p by 1920 resolution, but we do have to take into account the iPhone's smaller screen size. At 4 inches, its 640p resolution makes for an above-average pixel density of 326 ppi. It's not as perfectly clean as the Nexus 5's breathtaking 445 ppi, but honestly, one would have to look really hard in order to notice any distortion in the iPhone 5s's display as well. Both are exceptionally detailed and good looking, but the advantage goes to the Nexus 5 in this respect due to its ultra clean and sharp visuals. The iPhone 5S manages to be a bit easier to view outside than its opponent, which is enabled by its higher maximum brightness output of about 580 nits compared to the Nexus 5's 480 nits. Colors are nicely saturated and vibrant on the Nexus 5, however there is a bit of an excessive green and yellow color with the Nexus 5 display. It's not really a big problem, but should you compare it side by side with the display of the iPhone 5S, it immediately becomes evident that the Nexus 5's white balance is a bit off. Viewing angles seem to be just slightly better with the iPhone 5S, as it manages to retain a good brightness at a slightly wider angle. Featuring the newest version of the Android OS 4.4 KitKat, the Nexus 5 offers a stock user experience free from any manufacturer bloatware. With Android 4.4, Google is putting even more emphasis on its Google Now service, which has now expanded to the home screen itself by conquering its leftmost page. Other tweaks of various sizes can be found all over the place. There's a new setting to let you manage your launchers more easily. The Quick Office Productivity Suite is installed by default, and we'll be remiss if we don't mention the updated Hangouts app, which is the new one-stop shop for all of your messaging needs. Moving on to the iPhone 5s's iOS 7.03 OS, we're immediately greeted by its almost suspiciously bright and cheerful colors of the user interface. Beneath the new flat icons and fancy blur effects, though, one can find the same platform that has always defined a super intuitive experience with an iPhone. Yes, there is still no home screen widgets, and yes, it's still impossible to access the file system and upload or download files freely, but it's really easy to use and can actually do most of the things one can think of. These observations are especially true with iOS 7, which has added much needed features such as a more functional notification center, as well as the control center menu that lets you access frequently used settings in a quick and hassle-free manner. Equipped with the cutting-edge Snapdragon 800 chipset, the Nexus 5 doesn't have anything to fear in the performance department. This beast of an SoC boasts a quad-core Crate 400 CPU clocked at 2.3 GHz, as well as the powerful Adreno 330 GPU. On the other hand, the iPhone 5S doesn't seem to be in the mood for losing this one, as it's powered by the state-of-the-art A7 chipset. Being the first to adopt a 64-bit architecture, there's a dual-core Cyclone CPU inside that's ticking at a clock rate of 1.3 GHz. While this piece of silicon may seem considerably slower in comparison to the Snapdragon 800 on paper, it's worth noting that when we're doing a cross-platform performance comparison, such as this one, the internals aren't the only factor that has to be taken into account. That said, the iPhone 5S is a true speed demon, and when you take into account its PowerVR G6430 graphics chip, the result is a phone that never lags or stutters. There are the healthy 2 GB of RAM in the Nexus 5. That's still a very good amount for an Android phone, so users aren't expected to experience any significant slowdowns related to system memory. Meanwhile, there's 1 GB of RAM in the Apple iPhone 5S, which seems to be just enough to guarantee a smooth experience. Internal storage configurations for the iPhone 5S are 16 GB, 32 GB, or 64 GB, whereas the Nexus 5 comes with 16 GB or 32 GB memory. Sadly, microSD memory expansion isn't supported by the smartphone, so you have to make your choice wisely when deciding which variant to pick up. The iPhone 5S features a great on-screen QWERTY keyboard that makes typing surprisingly easy on a 4-inch screen, and that's valid for both the portrait and landscape use. That said, it's true that the keyboard isn't customizable and lacks some additional goodies such as support for swipe-based typing. Meanwhile, on the Nexus 5, you can pretty much do whatever you want with the on-screen keyboard, including the ability to install numerous third-party ones. The design of the stock keyboard is quite good, and thanks to its generous screen space, the keys are big enough to be comfortably pressed. Both the Nexus 5 and the iPhone 5S are lovely devices to browse the web on. The iPhone Safari browser is the more streamlined of the two, and it offers faster and smoother experience. Its new tabs view is very similar to that of Chrome, while the reading list feature can prove to be quite useful if you happen to own multiple Apple devices. The Nexus 5's Chrome browser is also very capable and fast, and if you happen to be a Chrome user on other devices, the syncing functionality may be of great benefit, though there is also Chrome for iOS as well. Being 4G LTE enabled, browsing and any other type of activities involving data transfers can be blazing fast with both phones, as long as your carrier has an LTE network in your area. In case it doesn't, there is always HSPA Plus compatibility though. Equipped with a vastly upgraded 8-megapixel camera, the Nexus 5 is much more ambitious than its predecessor in this department. Specs-wise, the Nexus 5's camera doesn't really cause too much excitement with its ho-hum sensor size of 1/3.4 inches and aperture of f2.4, whereas the iPhone 5S seems a bit better with its 1/3-inch sensor and f2.2 aperture. There is also an additional amber-colored LED complementing the standard LED flash of the iPhone 5S, designed to help the camera retain more natural color tones when shooting in very dark environments. Meanwhile, the Nexus 5 utilizes optical image stabilization technology as part of its camera's arsenal. The photos themselves look very similar most of the time. Both handsets capture a good amount of detail and reproduce colors in almost exactly the same way, meaning that they gravitate slightly towards the warmer side, though images seem realistic enough. You really can't find too many differences between the 8-megapixel cameras of the iPhone 5S and the Nexus 5. They're both very good, although not necessarily as capable as some other top contenders, such as the LG G2 or the Sony Xperia Z1. There's a bit of a tendency for the Nexus 5's camera to slightly overexpose certain shots, while the same images look better when captured by the iPhone 5S, although that's not a huge deal. Meanwhile, looking at some close-up photos, it becomes evident that most of the time, the iPhone 5S manages to come up with a more focused shot, thus elevating itself slightly above its opponent. We tend to prefer the indoor images taken with the Nexus 5, as they usually come out with more natural colors and lower noise levels, while at the same time keeping a comparable level of detail. The iPhone 5S's True Tone Flash does a pretty cool job when taking close-up photos in really dark environments, but in most cases the indoor shots of the Nexus 5 look better. When it comes to video recording, of course both can go up to 1920 by 1080 pixels at about 30 FPS, though the footage recorded with the iPhone 5S tends to have a bit more fluidity to it. Of course, watching video will be more comfortable with the bigger 5-inch display of the Google Nexus 5. It's true that its colors aren't as good as those of the iPhone 5S, but the larger size is definitely beneficial when it comes to video and gaming. It's very unfortunate that the Nexus 5 doesn't come with a pair of earphones in the box. Because of this, you have to either use an old pair if you have one, or purchase earphones separately, in case you want to listen to music or enjoy high-quality sound in apps or games. Thankfully, the iPhone 5S comes with the high-quality earpods in its box. Comparing loudspeaker performance, the one of the iPhone 5S presents us with a louder, clearer, and deeper tones, as the Nexus 5's one leaves a lot to be desired. It's not only weaker and thinner, but also tends to sound a bit distorted at its higher volume levels. The peculiar look of the Nexus 5's earpiece grill doesn't seem to be helping it much in delivering a good sound quality during calls. It's by no means bad, but it's just an average sounding earpiece with average volume. The iPhone 5S presents us with a slightly better calling experience, as voices tend to sound louder and deeper through its earpiece. When it comes to their microphones, both the iPhone 5S and Nexus 5 seem to be well equipped, as everything sounds pretty well on the other end of the line most of the time. Neither phone will hold the record when battery life is concerned, but the iPhone 5S's humble 1570 mAh juice pack seems to be just enough to qualify Apple's finest, ahead of the Nexus 5 in its 2300 mAh unit in the battery life race. Having run our custom battery test, which is specifically designed to replicate a typical usage scenario, we have discovered that the iPhone 5s can last slightly longer than its Android counterpart. 5 hours and 2 minutes for the iPhone 5s versus 4 hours and 50 minutes for the Nexus 5. There is no two ways about it. The Nexus 5 is a very well-rounded high-end smartphone that can offer you a satisfying experience across the board. With no major flaws with regards to its performance, there's one issue that seems to hold the Nexus 5 from rising to greatness. It lacks the premium factor. Let's put it this way, the Nexus 5 is premium on the inside, but just a generic-looking piece of gadgetry on the outside. Just how much this is going to affect your choice will naturally depend on your own preferences and financial status. Looking past the different screen sizes, operating systems and their user environments, the iPhone 5s proves to be the better device in most areas, although not by a large margin. Its screen, performance, camera, call quality, battery life and loudspeaker are all a bit better than those of the Google Nexus 5. Of course, Apple's handset also has the way better exterior, which makes it look like a jewel, a stark contrast to the bland design of Google's finest. Having said all that, we should now take a look at the all-important price tags of both smartphones. The Google Nexus 5 can be purchased from Google's Play Store, as long as it's available in your country, at the extremely alluring price of $349 for the 16GB version and $399 for the 32GB version off contract. At the moment in the US, Sprint and T-Mobile have currently announced plans to release the Nexus 5 with the Sprint version already on sale. However, get ready to shell out $149 for the 16GB version after a $50 mail-in rebate and put your signature on a 2-year contract with Sprint. On the other hand, an off-contract iPhone 5s can be purchased for $649, $749 or $849 for the 16, 32 or 64GB versions respectively, which is obviously much more expensive. In the US, AT&T, Verizon and Sprint are all selling the 5s starting at $199 with 2-year contracts. T-Mobile's pricing starts with an upfront payment of $149, followed by additional 24 monthly payments of about $20 plus the monthly price of your plan of choice. There is no doubt that the Nexus 5 is the much better deal considering the performance versus price ratio. If you're on a tight budget but would love to have a powerful smartphone, then your best option will be to order the Nexus 5 from the Google Play Store in case it's available in your country. If not, the Nexus 5 will still be a bit cheaper than the iPhone 5s, but the difference will no longer be that huge. However, if you value the feeling of having and working with a really sophisticated and gorgeous product, then it's worth considering getting the iPhone 5s, as it's one of the very few smartphones out there that can offer you what the Nexus 5 can't. Thank you for watching our video comparison between the Google Nexus 5 and Apple iPhone 5s. Feel free to check out phonearena.com for more info.